Hello, everyone. We are on topic 7.3, conducting World War I. We'll be looking at what technology was used, military strategies, and new innovation, and how all of this led to World War I becoming a total war. We'll look at the strategies that were used, and that includes political propaganda. What we'll be looking at, guys, World War I in particular was incredibly brutal. We're going to look at why 10 million people died during World War I. This is the first example of total war where it's not just soldiers who are seen as legitimate military targets, but it's also civilians and it's buildings that are for civilians. The Crimean War was the transition to modern warfare using automatic weapons. World War I is the first time total war is used. First of all, why was World War I called a world war? Well, first of all, guys, we have to go back to imperialism. What we're going to see is the recruitment of soldiers from Africa and from Asia. Particularly, we'll be looking at the recruitment of soldiers from India as well as from China. Propaganda was put out there to recruit soldiers who will take this uniform, this money, and this gun. And that was done not only to get more soldiers, but also to keep military groups and different battalions of soldiers separated by their ethnic background. The material demands were incredibly strong. Rationing would become the norm. Because so many men were being recruited into the armed forces, women, first in Europe and then in the US, became the labor force. And it would actually transform civilian life and give women a taste of personal and financial independence. German civilians paid an especially high price for the war because the British naval blockade cut off access to essential food imports. British and French forces overran Germany's African colonies. In all of their African colonies, Europeans requested food. They imposed heavy taxes. They forced Africans to grow export crops and sell them at very low prices. And again, they recruited African men to serve as soldiers and as porters. The US grew incredibly wealthy during the war by selling goods to Britain and France. And when the US finally did enter the war in 1917, businesses engaged in war production made tremendous profits. All right, we're going to take a look at the Schlieffen Plan for a minute, as well as the soldiers who were mobilized. So first, you can see France, Germany, Russia, and Britain mobilized millions of soldiers during World War I. But what we have to look at is the Schlieffen Plan. And when we're discussing why Germany is going to end up taking the blame for World War I, this is why. Well, this is one of the reasons why, but this is the biggest reason why. On August 4th, 1914, German troops crossed the border into Belgium on their way to get to France. And in the first battle of World War I, the Germans assaulted the heavily fortified city of Liège, and they were using the most powerful weapons in their arsenal, enormous siege cannons. They captured the city by August 15th. In their path, Germany left a wake of death and destruction as they advanced through Belgium towards France, shooting civilians and executing a Belgian priest they had accused of inciting civilian resistance. You cannot march through a neutral country on your way to engage with another country. In addition, this was a blatant attack on a neutral country. So therefore, this is why Germany, when they are given the Treaty of Versailles, end up paying war reparations and end up admitting total guilt for the war. And we'll talk about the impacts of that later on. We're also going to look at the fronts. And what I want you to do is take a quick look at who the Central Powers are, who the Allies are. So we're looking at 1914 to 1918. Everyone who is neutral is in that interesting shade of beige. So we're looking at Scandinavia and we're looking at Spain and Switzerland. But take a look at the lines where battles are fought. So we're looking at the Western Front, the furthest advances that are made by the Central Powers. And then if we're going over here, the furthest Russian advance in the west, so this would be your Eastern Front right through here. The stalemate. Here's the deal, guys. The nations of Europe entered the war in very high spirits. Everybody was confident of a victory, and actually, most people thought Germany was going to win this within the first couple of weeks. Most people thought at most this war will be over in a few months. And as we know, that was not the case. German advances faltered in September, and both sides spread out until they formed an unbroken line of trenches from the North Sea to Switzerland. This would be called the Western Front. The area behind German trenches at one point was so uninhabitable and so destroyed by bombings and by machine gun fire, and the earth just completely demolished. It was referred to as no man's land. Also called that because there was nowhere to hide and nobody could survive being out in the open. The German advance along the Western Front in 1914 was halted 20 miles from Paris. Trench warfare was not effective during World War I. And part of this, guys, is trench warfare had been used, but now it was being used with machine guns. And this ended up with horrendous consequences for soldiers. Britain attempted to block German ports, and total war altered the governments and societies across Europe and along the Eastern Front. While it brought women economic opportunities, it was incredibly hard on the majority of civilians, especially in Germany and in Russia. The generals on each side tried for 4 years to take enemy positions by ordering troops to charge across open fields. But again, we're looking at trench warfare. You spend your time hiding in the trenches or in foxholes, and then you have machine guns. And then people come charging at you across the open field, so you pop out of the trench and you shoot them. Or you have a machine gun and you simply mow people down. For 4 years, this went on, inconclusive on both land and sea, and resulting in the deaths of millions of soldiers. Military thinking remained largely unchanged during this time. There were significant developments in military technology, as this war saw the use of submarines, poison gas, tanks, and airplanes. And these are some of the weapons that were used. So we've got airplanes, we've got the Zeppelin, we've got shelling, we've got machine guns, we have siege cannons, we have U-boats, gas masks, because chemical warfare was a thing. It was introduced during World War I, mustard gas. Two of the most famous battles, the Battle of Verdun and then the First Battle of the Somme, that was actually the deadliest battle of World War I, just so you guys know, is the Battle of the Somme. Over 1 million people were killed in 5 months. The first day of this battle, 60,000 British soldiers died. In terms of military technology, we've discussed the new weapons, but we actually need to talk about advancements in medical technology. So one thing we're looking at here is the development of reconstructive surgery. Between bombs, between the small grenades that would explode the shrapnel, and between mustard gas, which could blind people, it literally melted the flesh off of their face. There was millions of people were coming home with massive and catastrophic injuries, life-changing. We're talking about people losing limbs. We're talking about people losing the ability to speak, such as this gentleman here. So what we see is the advancement of reconstructive surgery. And this went on for years. As you can see, even just by looking not at how much damage has been done, not by looking at the amount of tissue that has to be regrown, but you can also see how this gentleman has aged in the time it took to get him to go from this, we're reconstructing his jaw and his chin, to this. And obviously you can still see scarring, but he has his face back. We also see the introduction of faceplates. So sometimes there was simply nothing that could be done. This guy's from Boardwalk Empire, but fairly accurate depiction of what happened. Looks a lot nicer because it's Hollywood. But for soldiers who lost an eye, for soldiers who had damage done to the tissue on their face, faceplates were created, and these were actually made by using the other side of a soldier's face, and then they're metal. I'm not sure if it's tin or aluminum, but then they're painted to look as much like the soldier's face as possible. And they're held on by a pair of glasses. So this is how it starts. And a lot of these techniques, so we can see the metal framing done to stretch out the skin. A lot of these techniques have evolved, but their roots are right here. All right, so changing gears and looking at the Ottoman Empire. The Turks signed a secret alliance with Germany in 1914. The Ottoman Empire had engaged in an unsuccessful campaign, first against Russia. But then what happens is during this campaign, they lose territory. They begin deporting the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. This was started by the Young Turks. They were a nationalistic group, and their goal was to Turkify the nation. In addition, to the Armenians not being Turkish, they were also Orthodox Christians. This deportation caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands. When the British tried to enter the Ottoman Empire, and then they tried to subvert the government by promising Emir Hussein Ali of Mecca a kingdom of his own, if he would lead a revolt against the Turks, there will be an increase in the deaths of Armenians living within the Ottoman Empire. In 1915, leaders of the government set in motion a plan to expel and massacre the Armenians living within their borders. Reports vary. Most sources agree that there were about 2 million Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire at the time of this massacre. By the early 1920s, when the massacres and deportations finally ended, around 1.5 million of Turkey's Armenians had died, with many more forcibly removed from the country. Today, historians refer to this as a genocide. It is a premeditated and a systematic campaign to exterminate an entire group of people. And this is the first time that that word is applied, is the Armenian genocide. It has also been called the forgotten genocide, as a lot of people do not know what occurred in the Ottoman Empire during this time. In addition, the Turkish government does not acknowledge the enormity or scope of these events. Despite pressure from Armenians and social justice advocates from around the world, it is illegal in Turkey to talk about what happened to Armenians during this era. It is also at this time, as the Ottoman Empire begins shrinking in size, or I should say continues shrinking in size, that the Balfour Declaration of 1917 would be written. And in this document, the British government suggested to the Zionist leader, Chaim Weizmann, that they would view with favor the establishment of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. Throughout the war, 10 million soldiers would die. After World War I, 20 more million people would die of the Spanish flu. As soldiers returned home from the war front, they carried the flu with them. When World War I started, the U.S. had a small army and was committed to neutrality. In 1916, Germany sank the Lusitania. 1915, Germany sank the Lusitania, a passenger ship. The Zimmermann telegram resulted in the U.S. entering World War I. We know that Germany resumed unrestricted submarine attacks on U.S. ships. We've seen the conscription as the U.S. entered the war in 1917. So this is the first time people were being actively drafted at random. The Germans were able to break through and push within 40 miles of Paris, but the arrival of U.S. forces allowed the Allies to counterattack in August of 1918. The German soldiers retreated. An armistice was signed on November 11th. The war ended with officially November 11th, 1918. The following year, the Treaty of Versailles would be recognized. Thanks to its late but crucial entry into the war, the U.S. had a lot of influence over the subsequent peace talks. The Paris Peace Conference was dominated by Wilson of the U.S., Georges Clemenceau of France, and David Lloyd George of Britain. The U.S., Britain, and France each had different goals for the conference. Wilson hoped to implement his 14 points, an idealistic view of international affairs, and to establish a League of Nations. Others tried to influence at the conference, but were rebuffed or ignored. The Versailles Treaty followed a few of Wilson's suggestions, but did not include a League of Nations. Because the three men had conflicting goals, the Treaty of Versailles turned out to be a series of unsatisfying compromises that humiliated Germany but left it largely intact and still potentially the most powerful nation in Europe. With it, the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart. New countries were created in the lands lost by Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. When the war ended in 1919, the defeated Central Powers believed that all of Europe was equally to blame for the conflict and expected the peace terms to reflect this. But when negotiations began at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, it quickly became clear that the victors felt differently. The Allied negotiations at the Paris Peace Conference were dominated by the US, Britain, France, and Italy. Woodrow Wilson arrived with a plan, the 14 points. And this would make World War I the war to end all wars. Never again would this happen. The representatives of Britain, France, and Italy were less concerned with this goal and more concerned about punishing the Central Powers, specifically Germany, for causing the war. In the end, the treaties that emerged from the conference included the idealism of Wilson's 14 points and a great deal of punishment planned by the European representatives. While 5 treaties were actually negotiated and executed, one for each of the defeated nations, the treaty imposed on Germany was the strictest of all. What we are looking at, why this occurred. Unrestricted submarine warfare is a part of it. The sinking of the Lusitania is a part of it. Germany's strength in both military and technology, their power, their wealth, all a part of it. The Schlieffen Plan, though, big part of it. So the treaty that was negotiated between January and June 1919 in Paris was written by the Allies with no participation by the Germans. The negotiations revealed a split between the French, who essentially wanted to destroy Germany, their economy and their military, and then the British and the Americans, who didn't want to create any pretext for a new war. The eventual treaty included 15 parts and 440 articles. We're going to look at some of them today. Part 1 created the League of Nations that Germany was not allowed to join until 1926. Part 2, Germany had new boundaries. They lost quite a bit of territory. Part 3, a demilitarized zone. Part 4, Germany has no colonies. Part 5, armed forces were very low. Certain classes of weapons were forbidden. Part 8, Germany accepted liability for the war. They would make reparations. There was no specific amount mentioned. Part 9, other financial obligations. We know where this is heading, guys. Several of the ideas from Woodrow Wilson's 14-point plan were in the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations was established, but the U.S. did not join. Wilson's belief about national self-determination were realized with the creation of countries of Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Austria, and Hungary, out of lands that were once controlled by the German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian empires. Russia lost territory, guys, don't forget, because they withdrew from the war in 1917 with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. In theory, Wilson's calls for decolonization were heard with the creation of a mandate system. Again, in theory. According to the treaty, the overseas colonies of Germany and the non-Turkish speaking lands of the Ottoman Empire were to become temporary. Nope. Temporary mandates of the League of Nations. That didn't happen. As a mandate, each of these territories would be temporarily assigned to one of the Allied powers, mostly Britain and France. In theory, the mandate holder was to administer the territory temporarily while preparations were made for independence. But in practice, most of the mandates simply proved to be new colonies for the mandate holder. In the long term, the mandates in the Middle East proved to be the most consequential. In the British Mandate of Palestine, Britain promised in the Balfour Declaration to create a Jewish state. And over time, this created conflict with the Palestine Arabs who were already living in the regions. Other provisions in the Treaty of Versailles reflected the strong belief by the British, French, and Italian representatives that Germany should be punished for the war. Again, we look at the war guilt clause that forced Germany to accept the blame. The loss of 13% of Germany's total land, including Alsace and Lorraine, to France. Disarmament, which only allowed Germany to maintain a token army of 100,000. 32 billion in reparations to be paid by Germany to Britain, France, and Belgium, with more money to come later on. These provisions, designed to punish Germany, humiliated the German people, and it laid the foundation for the rise of Hitler in the 1930s. Further, they aggravated the U.S. Senate, who refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Without this ratification, the U.S. never joined the League of Nations. Without the U.S. as a member, seeing as we were the country that actually laid the groundwork for the League of Nations, the League was severely weakened and failed to maintain peace in the years leading up to World War II. Between 9 and 10 million people died in the war. The war created millions of refugees, many of whom fled to France and the U.S. Here, the influx of immigrants prompted the U.S. Congress to pass immigration laws that closed the doors to Eastern and Southern Europeans. With the rise of World War II, this is going to play a severe impact. One byproduct of the war was the influenza epidemic of 1918 to 1919, which started among soldiers headed for the Western Front and then spread throughout the world as soldiers came home, killing 20 million people. The war caused serious damage to the environment, especially along the Western fronts in France and Belgium. In 1918, Germany surrendered, and Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. France asked for harsh economic and political terms that would hurt Germany's recovery. The Weimar Republic reached a crisis in 1923. However, by 1925, the Weimar Republic, as Germany was called, was recovering a bit. Redrawing the boundaries of Eastern Europe proved to be the most difficult of the post-war problems. Much of the Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe drifted towards authoritarianism. The 1920s were a decade of dissatisfaction among people whose hopes had been raised by the rhetoric of war and then dashed by its outcome. In 1923, French occupation of the Ruhr and severe inflation brought Germany to the brink of a civil war. Fiscal reform, the creation of an American-led system to facilitate payments of war debts, and the French withdrawal marked the beginning of a period of peace and economic growth in 1924. With the Allied victory in the First World War, 4 great European empires came to an end. The German Reich, under the Hohenzollern dynasty, ended and was replaced by the Weimar Republic. This government was generally weak and ineffective because of a lack of public confidence and political infighting among the multitude of political parties. The Habsburg dynasty of Austria-Hungary fell as this empire was split into several successor states. Austria became a republic, but Hungary went through a period of political instability during which it had a succession of governments. In Russia, 300 years of Romanov rule ended with the assassination of Tsar Nicholas, his wife, his 4 daughters, and their son. This ended with the Bolshevik Revolution, replacing the Tsars with a communist party rule. In the territory lost by these empires, several new nation-states were created, including Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Political, social, and economic insecurity dominated in these new states in the years after the war. To the south, the Ottoman Empire ended in 1922, when the Ottoman Sultan was replaced by the Turkish Republic, founded by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Thanks for listening, guys. We're going to pick up later with topic 7.4. Cheers, y'all.